My name's Monk Rowe, and I'm pleased to be back with Wendell Harrison for a few follow-up questions. And you're looking good as you did last time.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That means a whole lot at my age. I'm still here.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm fascinated and curious uh, about Sun Ra, and I wanted to ask you. You entered that band for however many gigs you did as obviously one of the newcomers, and you were sitting next to people like Marshall Allen, who had been there
Yeah.
since the get-go. Did
Yeah.
did you get advice from the band members as well as Sun Ra about how to fit into whatever it is they were doing?
Yes. Yes. I was a young guy at that time. I think I was about 20 to 21 years old. And I had just I had just arrived from New York, from Detroit. And my first engagement was with Grant Green, and I was working around, and we would tour. But on my off weeks, I would play with Sun Ra. I was introduced to Sun Ra by a euphonium and trombone player, Kiani Zawati,
What's his
in
name?
which I was Kiani, Kinidi,
All right.
Kiani uh, um, Zawadi, and we were staying together in the loft on Broadway, 89 East Broadway Street, you know, and all kinds of people would come by and session, and we studied. Actually, we were vegetarians at the time, you know, and so he called Kiani to come in and play uh, for some, a few gigs and whatnot, and Sonra asked Kiani, did he know of a saxophone player? So Kiani recommended me because Farrell had went with Farrell was doing uh, presentations and performances with Sunrise as well, but but get, he had went with Train. John Gilmore had went with Art Blakey
Mm-hmm.
at the time, so it was a vacancy. So I made a rehearsal. Sunrise stayed on Third Street, not too far from Avenue A, you know, and I went over to Sunrise House, and he was cooking for the band. He's kind of like an old grandmother, He was cooking for the band, and it was like collard greens and like uh, uh, black eyed peas and whatnot, a real Southern cuisine, Because he's from Alabama, basically, by way of Chicago. So we ate a little something. I didn't really eat that much because I was so uh, uh, excited about playing with the group because I never played that way before. I never played that freestyle before. So when I started playing, uh, uh, he told me to don't forget about changes. Just think about the sound and imagery. You know, let your imagination take control.
Were,
You know,
were there changes in the tunes that you even could have worried about?
from what I remember, it was just notes, and you harmonized from your imagination. It could have been anything. You harmonize. You might hear it as a major, somebody might hear it as a minor, but it was about a collective sound. And what we worried about was he was really conscious and constant about the rhythm, because his rhythm, we would play things in 7/4, 7/8, 5/4, um, uh, sometimes 4/4, you know, but and he had bass lines that would go with particular rhythm. And we had to be conscious of the bass line and the rhythm and try to, when we improvise off the melody and improvise from the rhythm context. You know, stay with the rhythm, stay inside that 7/4 or 7/8, stay inside that groove. It's a groove that you have to stay with, so you play these ideas in the context of the groove and the energy level had to be up, because a lot of times he would play Celeste, like bells on the keyboard. He had synthesizers and whatnot, and that was a big deal back in the 60s. Synthesizer was something else, that was the new technology there,
Yeah, outer space.
yeah, space. And they didn't really, they hadn't really figured out how to make it a sound acoustically in terms of now these keyboards, they can sound like electric, like a grand piano,
Right.
and they got samples today that makes them sound a little more authentic. Back in the day, they were more sophisticated noise, or mood sounds. The moods that was common back in those days. It would sound like a spaceship, but like on TV.
Yeah.
Boop, 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 beep, boop, beep, boop, beep, boop, beep, boop, beep, lights go off and on.
I may have a misconception about the group and how they operated, but were you there enough to see how did those members of that group actually make a living? Were they making enough money to pay rent and eat?
No. At that time, see, Sun Ra had he got there in 58. I got there in 1960. When he brought all his members from Chicago. I'm talking about mainly Ronnie Boykins, the bass player. Pat Patrick was the baritone saxophone player, and Marshall Allen, alto, John Gilmore, tenor, and we was using Clifford Jarvis on the drums and Lex Humphrey. He had another drummer, might have been Phil Coran, I'm not sure, from Chicago, but I worked with him with Lex Humphreys, and no, all these guys, they were great musicians, so that would enable them to work shows. Like Pat Patrick would work Broadway shows and theater. Like I said, Gilmore had took a gig with Art Blakey, and all these guys was working the New York scene as well as with Sun Ra. And Sun Ra would say, well, I'm not going to pay you. It's not going to be that much money, but you will become famous if you work with me. I say, really? Well, he could talk. I mean, he was a salesman, constantly selling. I mean, he was really, his ideology, he was very, astute, very articulate when it came to expressing ideas and whatnot, and telling stories.
Yeah.
Sometimes the rehearsal would go out just listening to his stories, to give you a concept. I
don't mean to sound disrespectful at all, but did you ever get the notion in your head like, man, this cat's kind of crazy?
Of course, everybody did. But his family, I call them the family, the group that came from Chicago, they took him. I mean, he was really. They were really serious about Sun Ra, and they really respected him as a leader and as a spiritual advisor. I wasn't there yet, You know? So because like I was telling you, I'm a bebop. This is I have a bebop mentality, and everything in my world had changes. You know, everything in my world had changes, and that was my master, the keyboard and I worshiped chord changes at that
That was your
particular time.
spirituality, right?
It was my spirituality, you know. So he had to wean me off of that. He had to wean me off of that foundation,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And then I noticed a lot of guys. He was using a lot of musicians, but he liked the guys that didn't have that foundation so much. You know, he gravitated to those guys because it was less work to re-indoctrinate. You know, same with John Coltrane. John Coltrane liked Farrell because he had had the bebop foundation so much. You know, Farrell was like a blues kind of guy from uh, uh, Arkansas. You know, and he was young. Me and Farrell, he's a year older than me. He was a year older than me. He was born in 41. I was born in 1942. You know, and we had came to New York around the same day, but he was coming from San Francisco, Oakland, California, and I was coming from Detroit. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think the first gig we had, I think. Farrell was working with Sun Ra. He started working with Sun Ra before I did. And he was working at Cafe Wa. It's a club called Cafe Wa in the Village, you know. And when he wasn't working with Sun Ra, he was washing dishes in the place, you know. And you know, we were kids, you know, we kids trying to find our way, you know. And one time he was asking for his own showcase, his own performance, and the owner gave him a night. I think it was like maybe a Monday night or something like that. And Farrell, for his rhythm section, he chose a Blue Note All-Star group, Billy Hickens, and you know. So I said, wow. And I didn't think much of it at that time, but think about Sunrise, think about Farrell and his perception of himself. He always had a big image of himself, you know, in how he wanted to present himself, you know. And that's very important. He had that concept of himself. I think it's very important in terms of being a leader, you know. And they had to pay these guys, you know. It was more than what they was expected to pay, you know. Farrell saying, "You got to pay my band," you know. So, and then at that point, he was working with Sun Ra, and then with around with different groups, and then John Coltrane. He was hanging out with John Coltrane. John liked him, you know. So he did more and more with John, and John started using him on gigs and whatnot, and they started touring and whatnot. The rest is history.
Yeah.
Now with Sun Ra, I used to make fun of Sun Ra, you know, but something that I really took serious when I saw he was recording everything, you know, rehearsals, and he had 2 record labels, you know, that he was producing and marketing his music and his music was in the marketplace. Of course, it was like a small niche,
yes,
fan base, but it was a fan base nevertheless that he nurtured. You know, he was just getting, well, I guess he had started in Chicago, but he was nurturing this fan base, and he didn't care anything about conforming to the status quo in terms of at that time the major record companies in terms of being a contracted artist for a major label. He didn't want to do that because he would have to conform and play the like a contemporary sound, a homogenized sound. That's what he
homogenized. Good word. Good word. Can I ask if you recall on the live gigs you played, if he attracted a mostly white audience or a most black audience?
He what?
What was that?
Yeah, he was mostly white.
I'm sorry.
It was mostly a white, young, Bohemian hippie audience. You remember those days?
Indeed.
You're probably too young.
No, I remember. It wasn't in my spirituality though, just yet.
The young hippie, and the beat, another one, the beatnik crowd. Remember the beatnik crowd?
Yeah.
And they would smoke hashies. LSD at that time was big. The LSD, hallucinogenics, they were big at that. But this is actually peyote too. Peyote and hashies. That was the drug of the hippies, or they called themselves elite. You know what I mean? Back in those days. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about the 50s and 60s. You know, but that was his audience, and then you had professional. I mean, these guys was like anywhere from 18 to 60 years old. And in the places where they performed, just like the Cafe Wild, they recited poetry in those places as well as this music. So he would have, a lot of times Sunrise would have a poet and Sunrise would recite poetry as well. Even with saying, you know, he was saying, you know, and he was great. He was great. They just loved him. They just really loved him, you know.
I just have this picture of you the next morning after a gig with him, meeting someone for coffee and saying, "Man, you should have seen what I did last night."
That's right. That's right. I would talk about it. I would talk. This guy is crazy, you know. This guy is nuts. But guess what? He turned me on I played a gig with him at a place called the Baby Grand in Harlem. And we had to play dance. We had to play like Duke Ellington, Fletcher Henderson. We had to play swing and little bebop, but mainly because he could play like Arteta on the piano, you know, Fletcher. You know, he could play the stride. It kind of reminded you of Monk in a way, Thelonious Monk, in a way, where he could play the stride, and that was really where he's that age. He was that age. He came out of the swing era. I mean, he was born in at that particular period of time, so he could play like a Duke Ellington or a Fats Waller or you know, that real swing. So he told me, he knew I could play these tunes. So we went and played at the Baby, it was called the Baby Grand Ballroom on 125th Street in Harlem. And we were playing Satin Doll and Don't Mean a Thing and some of those older tunes. And he said, yeah, he liked the way I played that. He said, well, he play changes now, you know. So I got to play tunes, and he really liked that. You know, I made the gig, you know, right. Really made it happen for him, you know.
Yeah.
He was very pleased. So a lot of times I would play these, he called me to play these traditional dances. So this social dancing, there people social you know, two steps, foxtrots, and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff, tangos and all that kind of stuff. You know.
Well, let me foxtrot you back to Detroit for a moment. I want to talk about Tribe Records and the magazine, and I noticed this. This could be a total coincidence, but you started with your partner Tribe Records in 1971. Is that correct?
Right.
And back in New York, Charles Tolliver and his partner started Strata East in 1971.
Yeah.
Is that a coincidence, or was it the atmosphere and relationship?
That was a coincidence. Now I played. It's really ironic because I played with Sun Ra with Charles Tolliver too, and we played other gigs. I played other gigs with Charles and myself with like Ola Tunji, like the cougar player from Nigeria. We played dances and stuff. We was young, so we playing all kinds of gigs, dance gigs. We playing all kinds of social parties, you know, for West Africans, and you know, we playing Latin stuff, you know. Then we played bebop as well, you know. But Charles is 6 months older than me. He was born in March. I'm born in October, 1942. So when I came back, I actually came back too. I was coming from California and stopped in Detroit on the way back to New York, and got trapped by my mother. You know, that's another story. You know, she laid a trap for me. You know, my mother was a teacher, you know, masters and whatnot, and my father had a PhD. You know, but he was teaching at Southern University. But anyway, my mother, I had to sell her on being a musician. You know, I'm paying rent, but she, at that particular time, she had quit school and she went into real estate. So she had houses and stuff, you know, that she was renting out, and she couldn't understand why I'm in New York paying rent, and because she didn't know anything about the entertainment industry or the music industry, especially jazz, you know. She didn't know. See, how can you make a living and you don't even own anything? Are you gonna ever own anything? She wanted me to meet a young lady that was that she, in her mind, that was real credible lady, you know, and she thought that we could get married and make a family together, you know, have a kids and whatnot. Never did happen, you know. But she did happen where she was very instrumental in managing and administrating some of my gigs and my career, you know. And when I started working and teaching here in Detroit, when I came back and started teaching here in Detroit, Phil Randland and myself, Phil came from Indianapolis, and we put together a production company where we was producing shows at the Art Institute. There's a museum, Detroit Arts Institute of Arts. It's a museum, and we would produce concerts every 3 months, you know. And then I started teaching here at the same time, teaching jazz studies at a place called Metro Arts, and so we produced these shows. It was a program book that we got together, and we had people that was working as the Harrison Association. It was working and selling ads and whatnot and tickets, ads to the program guide. It was a program guide, and they would sell ads, and that money, the revenue off of that money, would actually support the musicians, promotion, and renting of the venue. very successful at that particular time because people wanted to do things. You know, people wanted to, especially the black community was coming together under Nixon, was really coming together, you know, at that particular time, you know, because people were very distraught about the war in Vietnam and the economy was down at that particular time. You know, people didn't have jobs. You know, and social unrest, riots was breaking out everywhere. You know, people was restless. So anyway, so people would come together. We had artists, photographers, writers, musicians. We came together and formed an organization that presented concerts and stuff every quarter, and that became a foundation for the publication magazine called Tribe. It was a social economic issue, you know, as well as politics and art, you know, and it was very successful. Then we took some of that money and put it into a record label called Tribe.
Let me ask you about Tribe. When would bands come to you, groups of musicians, with a finished audio recording, and then you would take that and put it out on your label? Or did you work with the musicians from the get-go?
No, well, I was working with a cadre of musicians. I was working with Phil Ranlin, which we found started a partnership, Tribe Records. The magazine was different, you know, but I needed some help on administrative stuff so I incorporated with Phil and myself as Tribe Records.
Yes.
And then Marcus, I used Marcus Belgrave, Harold McKinney, basically, was the network, because we was playing in each other's group. I was playing in Marcus's group. Me and Phil was playing in Marcus's group. We was playing in Harold's group, you know, and also playing in my group. So we was actually playing in each other's group. And we knew, although the music was different because we all were composers. We were composers. And so we would write some things, and everybody would rehearse it, and then we would perform it at different times. You know, I would performing Harold's group. Actually, I've been performing with Harold long before I went to New York. You know, I was performing with Marcus in Philadelphia and Chester, Pennsylvania. I was performing with him on the road because we was on the road with other groups, and he was writing music and stuff. So I knew Marcus's music. Same with Phil. Now we recorded these, like the first, his album, my album, Phil's album, Harold McKinney's albums. We all did as a collective, you know, but under each other's name. And then Doug Hammond came in with a tape. He had talked to Charles Tolliver, and Charles Tolliver didn't have time, you know, at that particular time. I say, well, I'll give you some time, man. Give me the tape and have listened to it. And it was good. It was good. It was very unique, you know, because it's kind of like free, but kind of like bebop, kind of like the Charles Mingus. Sounded like a lot like Charles Mingus with a groove. And then guy from Ann Arbor, Ron Brooks, submitted some music. And David Durrah out of Cleveland, you know, submitted some music. So anyway, that's how that started, and then we distributed this music by independent distributors that was happening all over America. Independent distributors, they wanted to distribute their own product and their own have their own catalog, as opposed to being as opposed to working for the Atlantic Records or big corporation. You know, this is like a independent revolution, you know, as it were, you know, in the 60s. Everybody was rebelling, basically, from the status quo. Everybody was wanting to do their own thing. They wanted to have their own autonomy. We wanted to own our own music, and if we failed at it, we didn't have nobody to blame but ourselves. we couldn't blame anybody else. You know, traditionally speaking, if the record was unsuccessful, you could blame the record company. Oh, they messed me up. The record company messed me up. The record, you know. But this way, we were the record companies. We were the record company, you know.
Yeah.
So we were making sure there was a success the best way we could.
Yeah. It's sort of like saying, so, oh, I can't blame my bad saxophone playing on my reed anymore.
right. So we worked 24 hours. We wouldn't even, we were so excited. I think the new adventure, the autonomy gave us so much energy of being on our own and to make it happen. So we would lose a lot of sleep, think about how we were going to do things, because we didn't know how to do things. We learning. We had the desire to do something, but we had to learn the mechanics of it. You know, the infrastructure. You had to learn about that. What makes how can I get the music to the marketplace? What makes it successful? How many radio stations? We had to talk about radio stations and program directors. We were dealing with program directors and traffic. You know.
Yes.
You know.
I'm guessing
that kind of thing. And then you're dealing with.
I'm guessing between the record label and the magazine that your dining room table was usually covered with papers and business.
Yeah. And we meet, and everybody, the dining room table is where it's at. It all happened at the dining room table. All happened. People would come in from all over the world, and we sit at the dining room table, you know, and figure stuff out, have meetings and stuff like that, you know. And we still got the dining room table in there. It's happening today, you know. 55 years later, it's still going on.
Wow. And some of this music
so anyway,
made its.
We got.
I'm sorry. Some of this music made its way over to Europe, didn't it?
The first big marketplace we hit was Poland, Czech Republic. You know, they're the ones that did the big write-up in a magazine talking about the label and to talk about our first three different releases and whatnot. Then Germany, then France and Spain and eventually Japan, you know, Australia, you know. But we had 15 distributors at that time. There was ordered. I was mainly selling myself, you know, because I was excited. Then I had other people that helped me out, but I got it started myself. I would contact the distributors myself and started packaging these records and taking orders. You know, after we had sent everything out to the radio stations and the magazines and newspapers was writing articles, then I would get on the telephone and talk about how the records was being covered and it's being reviewed and radio stations is playing, it's in rotation and blah, 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 blah. And so the distributor said, well, send me a box. And the box was like 25. And then next month they want 2 boxes, of each. I'm talking about each. A box of mine, box of Phil's, box of Marcus, box of Harold, Doug, So I'm selling a catalog. And he picking things off the catalog. I stumbled into that.
Would you get to the point like you're saying, okay, I've sent 3 boxes to this distributor and I don't have any monetary return on it? Was that your job also?
Yes. That was really hard. Because I didn't know. I'm learning all the time. I'm learning. After a while, I send them a box. If they wanted more, they would have to pay up front. So there was always behind in payment. It was always behind. And it was always a month behind in payment, And I learned that and some of the guys didn't pay us. We got screwed, because we was small. We was a small company, and they knew they could take advantage. Some of the bigger distributors knew that we were small, and they paid us if they felt like paying us, they'll pay us. But if they didn't feel like it, But it was 2 of them like that. It was 2 distributors that was like that, So, but for the most part, we was pretty successful. Now it came to the point where these people wanted more records. So we started getting calls about licensing. That was new. I said, licensing. Oh man, license. That means we don't have to press up. We can just send them the master. Boy, just one master, and then press up thousands of records from that one master, So that made it easy for us, myself, because I wouldn't have to send, I wouldn't have to press. There's no press cost. You wouldn't have to, with no mailing costs, that cut my whole operation. The operation cost, it cut it 75%.
Wow.
75%. All we had to do is record and then send the masters out to these major labels in Europe and Japan, whatnot. But this happened in 1990.
Wow. Well,
because instead of sending the masters, we would send the CD, a master CD,
right,
instead of sending the tape. Before that, we would have to go in the studio and make a copy of the master.
Right.
You never send your original masters nowhere. You never send original masters nowhere. You always have maintained that. You make copies and send it out.
Yeah.
So that's at that time, Tribe became worldwide. At that time we had like 5 or 6 major labels around the world that was distributing and selling our music and marketing our music. Now we're up to 15 labels around the world.
Well, it's been a labor of,
in a nutshell, that's
it's been a labor of love and a labor of soul and everything else in between. And I admire that your passion for it. So I'd like to wrap up today with a question about jazz in society. Now, you're describing this intense relationship with local musicians and spreading it worldwide. And when I think back to the swing era, that jazz and swing had this social dancing aspect and entertainment value, Do you have a thought about jazz in America now? Where does it fit? Does it have a distinctive character in America now?
You have a lot of different jazz styles now, as you know. You know, uh, I'm 80 years old. My concept comes out of the genesis of my concept came from the 50s, from the bebop era. And when I write, I'm writing uh, uh, like Oliver Lake, not Oliver Lake, but Oliver Nell, Oliver
Oliver Nelson.
Duke Ellington. Yeah, Oliver Nelson, Duke Ellington, and my head is like that. My head is grounded in that sound. Although I write all kinds of ways, I got skills to write all kinds of ways, but I even learned how to deal with hip hop. Techno, because I worked with Carl Craig, Then I started dealing with rap. Like I worked with a guy by the name of Proof. Put out a record called Grown Folk Shit. That's the rappers. you know, you know. So I'm kind of in terms of me, I'm kind of like an eclectic with a jazz base, a jazz foundation, but I have an eclectic. I deal with African concepts, I deal with Latin concepts, hip hop, but really coming from a jazz perspective. I use all these elements. I even use sunrise, but sparingly. I go out, but I come back. Always come back to my bass. My jazz concept. I might go out and play some space music for a couple minutes, but I always come back to who I am. And that's how it's been selling over the years. Jazz today, it's generated by the college campuses, university campuses today, which is more academic, more academic, because they don't have the engagements that we had back in the 50s and 70s. We were playing this music every week for a live audience every week. We playing gigs, So we plan for the audience and trying to get approval of the audience. And at the same time, trying to sell records too, because if we went too far out, our records wouldn't sell, So we would learn how to play and improvise, but including melodies and harmonics that everybody could actually digest. The average person could digest. The students now seem to be they playing for themselves academically, and they find out how many notes can you play at once. You can play all these notes. How fast can you play? And they have great technique, but the stories often is not really as prolific as the stories that we told back in the 50s and 60s. This come from my point of view.
Yeah. Well said.
So
I like your the term the audience could digest something that is acceptable to them and they can get something out of.
Yeah, they can get something. In other words, they could take home something with it. I remember he really played because he played a nursery rhyme over here. They relate to something.
Yes,
a melody here that they can pick up on that empathize. So not a bunch of scales and chords. Those are just elements of creation. Those are just tools of creation. It's like using all the crayons in the crayon box, or all the tools in the toolbox. You You just use, but anyway, you have, it's all about storytelling, all about story. Just like I'm talking now, I'm telling the story, and I try to make it as interesting as possible. And I try to make it articulate ideas that people can relate to.
Yeah.
You know, instead of using a lot of academic phrases that's in the music, just over their head. You know, yeah, that doesn't work. You know.
Yeah.
Of course, I have to learn that, you know, but it's like something that I've learned just putting this music together. I have to do the same thing with interviews and conversation, right. You know.
Well, I'm very glad that all the work you've done over the years in the 70s and beyond seems to be still something you can build on, and that it's ongoing. I'd also like to say that you had one of the best band names ever with Mama's Licking Stick Clarinet Ensemble.
Yeah.
I love that.
You know where that came? You know where that came from?
I do not.
My mother, you know, every time I was 8 years old, they gave me the clarinet. 8 years old. Okay, for discipline and punishment. If I do something wrong, instead of giving me a licking, hitting, a spanking, play your clarinet for an hour today. You know, and I would hate that. That was like punishment to me. Sitting in a room with a clarinet, sitting in a room with this thing for an hour, you know. I mean, that was something else. You know, that's the most horrible thing. And then I had to, after that, I was made to clean up my room and then do homework.
Well, you didn't know that it was going to pay benefits later.
I didn't know that. You know, I was just all I knew, I was being punished.
Yeah, you know, Buddy DeFranco called the clarinet an agony stick.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, to get it to play in tune,
yeah,
and to keep your hands over the open holes, your fingers over the open holes and stuff like that, and you can't get a lot of volume out of it, you know. So what you play has to be really interesting. It has to be really interesting, you know.
Well,
to keep it.
This has been interesting for me, and I want to thank you for these great conversations, and I hope you never run out of crayons in your crayon box.
That's beautiful. I appreciate that, Monk. You got the right name too.
Thank you.
I like you. You got the right name. The priest of jazz, the high priest of jazz.
Yeah.
The monk.
All right.
Yeah. I love it.
Thank you very much for your time, Wendell.
Thank you.